Okay, well, let me jump on Mere Christianity there and talk about Lewis. Reason for God, you list your three major influences in order: Kathy, C.S. Lewis, Jonathan Edwards.
Mhm.
There's no doubt the book is going to argue that Kathy is your greatest influence. I'm not, that's a pretty easy one right there. And I'll talk a lot about Kathy's background, Kathy's story, just like everybody else's in there. Would you still put Lewis and then Edwards in that order?
Yeah, let me say something about Kathy though.
Sure.
Um, Kathy will probably push back and say that she doesn't read as much as me. She reads fiction, she doesn't read theology, and so she'll push back and say um, that that Tim tells me, Tim teaches me theology,
Sure.
and but then the point is that she's just not a passive recipient.
Yeah.
So she really, really processes, and there's things that I'll tell her that she says, "Well, that doesn't fly
Yeah.
in me." She's very opinionated in a good way, or says, "Well, how are you going to use that?" Or don't I wouldn't go down that path because I really don't think that's all that helpful. That's not that compatible. So she was very much like a kind of a tutor, but it's ironic because when I say it's ironic, she'll say that she's not doing that so much from the way you would do it with a doctoral advisor is that you would come in with these ideas, and because this guy knows more than you do about theology, he would say, I wouldn't go there, I wouldn't go there. That's good, that's very
Yeah.
helpful. Kathy doesn't have that, but she knows me very well, and
Yeah.
she knows what we're trying to do in ministry. And so very often she would say, I don't think that's I know you're reading about that, but I wouldn't spend a lot more time on that. I'd go over here, I'd go over there. And the other thing is that she'll very often try to put what I've been telling her in her own colloquial, um, she's just like, put the cookies on the lower shelf. What you mean is this, right? And so the what that would do is it forced me to be simple, or in many cases give me a better way of expressing that truth, because she just came up with it,
Yeah.
because she's a good writer
Yeah.
and she wants to. So in many ways she's a big influence, but really very differently than the others,
Yeah.
because she doesn't come in with more information about the content, the theology content or philosophy. She comes in knowing me and knowing our ministry and actually knowing people.
Yeah.
And so it's like what Dr. Lovelace used to call, well, I is like a salad shredder. I bring her stuff, and then she tends to shred it up and say, I wouldn't put that in, I wouldn't put that in, I would say it like this. And sometimes, by the way, she doesn't always win, but sometimes I win. But in the process of it, I still formulate things better.
Yeah.
So she really is unique. She is the biggest influence, but she's not even in the same category.
Yep.
What the way Lewis works is Lewis was just so clear.
Yeah.
That's the thing that he has is clarity. Um, and did you know I saw I think I even know where the book is, but somebody put I don't think maybe you heard this. It took Reason for God, Basic Christianity, Simply Christian,
Mm.
and Mere Christianity.
Mm. Okay.
This person considered four really popular presentations of Christianity to skeptical people. So N.T. Wright, Tim Keller, John Stott, C.S. Lewis, and put it into a one of those software programs that looked at metaphors and images.
Got it.
And as you might guess, Lewis had 4 times more metaphors and images than the other 3 books. So the other 3 books, including mine, read much more like a paper, like a seminary paper or a graduate school paper. And Lewis's, now, admittedly, Lewis's were radio talks, so you have to
Right.
keep that in mind.
Right.
And when you do radio talks, when you're doing oral communication, you definitely lighten up. You don't do as much in the way of principles. You do more illustrations and all that. Nevertheless, it it really, when I saw that, I said absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say actually, Edwards is similar,
Okay.
because and my son, as you know, Michael
Right.
did his PhD on how Edwards used language to evoke sense experience. And Edwards is astounding. He doesn't talk about God's love. He talks about the fountain of his love sparkling. He doesn't, he talk, he peppers, he doesn't tell stories until he actually started preaching to the Indians on the Stockbridge Indians. But he never told stories, but everything was turned in everything into a metaphor. And that's a little different than Lewis. Lewis did use a lot of metaphors, but he actually also told lots of illustrations and lots of. So those two taught me, because they're very different. Lewis is not Reformed, um, and whenever he actually gets into the atonement or justification, he's kind of murky. I think he's a high. I think he was a high church Anglo-Catholic, basically.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
the reason I was asking about Edwards and Lewis is because Lewis, as talking to Mako Fujimura, and he says what I'm sure you've heard a million other times. We knew if Tim didn't have time to prepare his sermons that week, we were going to hear a lot of Lewis.
right?
So
Because
Lewis is what's in your bloodstream. That seems to be what you go to. That's your default, in that sense. But at the same time, as like a model for you, I mean, you're not a novelist, and you're not an academic in that sense. So that's why I was wondering about Edwards, because I've been trying, Tim, to figure out a hierarchy of apologetics, evangelism, and revival in your life.
right.
I actually think revival is the top
I
hierarchy.
don't know if it's top or not, but I mean, look, I do know Edwards because he was a theologian of revival and experience was extremely important to me.
Right.
So I got to say, John Owen actually interestingly enough, Edwards tells you about it, but doesn't. I actually felt like I wonder how much he got from John Owen, because John Owen really, his meditations actually do what Edwards is talking about. But for me, Owen is a little later,
Okay.
and Edwards was theologian of revival,
Yeah.
as well as being just really brilliantly reformed, period. So my reformed theology is what was originally an Edwardsian theology. I read the Institutes later. I read John Owen later. So really my first real uh, reformed theology came to me first of all through Edwards. And it's like even fair that Bavinck and Kuyper comes later too.
Yeah.
So I do think I get Reformed theology as a revival, as a theology of revival first. It's true.
Yep.
Then as a theology of worldview and understanding all of life, that comes later. I think even that comes later.
So that would be like Loveless basically was your conduit then to Edwards.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course he takes it in a he was not as narrow. I mean, he was a PCOSA guy, and so he was always trying to bring in social concern.
Yeah.
He would say that in fact, when he talks about revivalism, he brings out the fact that revivals usually led to social concern as well as evangelism, and it's true.
Right.
And Edwards, when you read Edwards' sermons, he's very concerned about. There's one of his sermons called "Envious Men," which is about greed, basically. He was pretty down on,
right.
his thing on the poor. That his dissertation on the poor that had a huge impact on me.
Well, that's why I was trying to figure this out, is because in your preaching, it seems like, and really your writing as well, it seems like you're always coming back to trying to get people to have that experience of God.
And that's Edwards.
Right. So that's why I put that revival at that top category, because it seems that you use apologetics to kind of clear the ground. Evangelism, of course, is your goal, but there's this revival instinct that seems to always be there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. When I think if I had read Calvin first,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have noticed how often Calvin says that without experience in the heart, doctrine and truth is nothing. I mean, it's remarkable how often Calvin calls on, so this is about piety of the heart, true godliness has to have piety, and Owen especially. So I mean, I don't think I would have seen it as strongly if I do notice that people that start with Calvin and the Puritans without without somebody like Edwards, very often have a hardness to them.
Yeah.
And I think with what I had with Edwards was that emphasis on almost a mysticism that was very intriguing to me. And then I discovered, by the way, Lovelace also had us read Owen early on. I just didn't get into a lot of his spiritual mindedness and his meditations on Christ and his whole idea. You know, Owen's whole thing is, which has come to me more later in my life, was that the way you get sanctified is you actually see the glory of Christ by faith.
Got it.
And it happens in the gospel, and it happens in prayer, and that's what actually changes you. And it's very, very Edwardsian. That's what makes me think Edwards. I mean, obviously Edwards is later, so. In fact, that's, you know, Lewis talked about a secret thread,
Okay.
which is that there's the same artworks and the same music, the same stories move you to what Lewis and Tolkien would call the underlying reality. They believe that fiction gets you in touch with the underlying reality of what God made creation to be.
Yeah.
I mean, Tolkien's mytho, you know, his
Right. Yep.
boy, his On Fairy Stories, which I don't remember
I've
when I
got it
read.
in there.
It was after seminary. I'm pretty sure I didn't read it in seminary,
Okay.
but had a massive impact on me.
Yeah, I've got that in there.
And yeah, his basic idea is that we know we shouldn't die. We weren't made to die. That good triumphs over evil. That there are other beings besides human beings to talk to.
Yeah.
That all those things are things that in fiction, especially fairy tale fiction, the reason it resonates is because at a deeper level, we know that that's how we were created. We were created for the Garden of Eden. We were created to talk to other beings like angels. We were made not to lose our loved ones and all that
Right.
stuff. And I just know that so Lewis and Tolkien would say that the deeper reality is the thing that you're trying to get people in touch with.
Yep.
So I think that I actually, by the way, maybe I actually do think that sermons can do that too.
Sure. Okay.
Because in a way, here's a skeptical person that comes in. They don't believe in miracles, and then they watch Lord of the Rings or they watch these movies, and it moves them.
Yeah.
Because even though intellectually they don't believe in a supernatural world, at a deep level they know it's there, and so it connects them to it.
Yeah.
I think you can do the very same thing if you preach skillfully.
Yeah.
To a skeptic.
Right.
They have the same impact as a fairy story, which of course, I don't know how I say that briefly without it sounding like I'm, saying sermons are really fairy stories. But the fact is, because Lewis says that Jesus Christ is the one myth that became a fact.
Right.
It's a true fairy story.
Yep.
And there, because it's talking about triumph over evil and triumph over death. And so when you preach it as truth, you're actually, this is the spot where skeptics are really confronted with something that says this actually happened. You're making the case that actually rationally really happened.
Right.
And yet their heart is on your side.
Yeah.
Now there's a part of your heart that's not on your side because they're trying to hold down the truth and unrighteousness, but
Right.
there's a part of their heart that's on your side because they want that to be true.
Yep.
They want there to be triumph over evil and triumph over death.
Right.
So, by using non-theological terms, by interstitial space,
Yeah.
where Kathy and I fought for saying we're not fundamentalists or liberals.
Yeah.
Everybody was always trying to make us one or the other, and we just fought, and we got enough people to agree that we were neither, to be able to at least be willing to come. If they had believed we were one or the other, they would never have shown up.
Right.
That's one big deal. Yep. Interstitial space. Secondly, making the non-Christian a ratified participant.
Yep.
That they really literally are. And how do you do that? How do you talk about Christian? And the book behind his book, a guy named Lichterman,
okay,
who wrote a book some years before called Elusive Togetherness.
Got it.
It's a Princeton University Press book about, he said, if a Christian group has to change totally the way they talk to outsiders from the way they talk inside,
Got it. Yep.
it can't work that you're going to bring people in. They're just going to be alienated or confused. In other words, if you have to do code switching.
Yep.
And what that book was trying to say is if only if inside the community you talk about your own faith
Yep.
and build each other up in your faith in language that doesn't exclude non-Christians completely.
Yeah.
Will you be able to bring them in and they feel like I can be in here and process this?
Yep.
And the third thing was what he calls the conversion of cultural capital.
Okay.
Which means that I used cultural capital, I turned it into religious capital by always saying, here's what the Bible says, but here's what your own authorities say too.
Yep.
And I was thinking, all right, where did I learn that? That's your question.
Yeah, it is.
Where did I learn that?
Yep.
And I would say, even though I never went to LaBrie had a major impact. LaBrie was a place where you could come. You were accepted if you were not a Christian. You were asked, you were surrounded by Christians.
Mm.
There was worship, but there was also total openness. Everybody knew there was lots of non-believers that were there. There was a willingness to let anybody ask any question. There was if you showed up pregnant, by the way, you can if you read the stuff, if you showed up, Frankie Schaeffer even talks about this.
Yeah.
He says they were not hypocrites. I mean, if you showed up pregnant and, out of wedlock, you were just taken care of. And Edith would find a way to, set up a place where you could have your child. Yeah. And nobody condemned you.
Yeah.
It was just, and I realized that, and also the Young Life had the very same approach. And I was involved with Young Life in Lewisburg, Mifflinburg, and what was the third one? In other words, the InterVarsity folks, including Kathy's sister,
yep, Susan,
all ran Young Life clubs. In Lewisburg, they had a Young Life club in Lewisburg, one in Mifflinburg, and one in Milton. Okay, these were towns, just 3 high schools. And I used to go to this, and it was based on the idea. It was based on the LaBrie idea, which was you had Christians and non-Christians together, and yet you were worshiping, and yet you were singing, and you were preaching. Right. But you assumed that the non-Christians were present. And you found ways of talking about Christianity in a way that made sense to the non-Christians because you used vocabulary they could use, they understood, and you connected to their cultural narratives. So like you would play, you'd play a song that was a top 10 song. Yep. And then you would say, now there's themes in here that the gospel speaks to. Yep. So I was just I never went to LaBrie, but I was also at Gordon Conwell filled with people there who had been to LaBrie. Right. Adele Calhoun, who's those 6 couples. Yep. That, there were 6 women that Kathy became good friends with, which now were the 6 couples. David and Louise, I'm pretty sure Louise never went there, but Jane, Frazier, and Adele Calhoun both were at LaBrie. And a lot of people of my generation who were Christians were at LaBrie. Yeah. So I heard a ton of stuff about it, and basically it was practiced at Young Life. And when I started Redeemer, we said, why can't we have a church like that? Yep. I was very influenced by the study center. What they're going to try to say there in the book, which I think is important, is that there, in many ways, all these things were looking at to LaBrie. Right. And LaBrie was a truth and love, a real Christian community. Yeah. In which there was real emphasis on seeking the truth and letting people ask questions. And that's where non-Christians and doubters were obviously ratified participants. Right. Welcome, doubters welcome. Okay. And at the same time, it was also a real Christian community, though, not a, right. The trouble, for example, Willow Creek, separates and says, well, we don't, Christians come on Wednesday nights. I mean, not that it really happened, but the
Yeah.
theory was Sundays is for non-Christians and Wednesdays is for Christians. And there's no real sense then on Sunday that you are being invited into a real functioning community.
Yep. Right.
And what the study centers had was this idea that non-Christians were being invited into a real functioning community, lots of hospitality, lots of love, um, uh, clear faith, and yet extremely open to doubters and willing to talk about things. I would say, when I look at the book, is trying to say that all of these things, Ligonier, all these different things were basically inspired by the LaBrie model. And I'm here saying that I think I was too.
Right.
Even though I've got plenty of people I know who were there under Schaefer, but I never, but it had a huge impact on Kathy and my understanding of things. And
I think I wrote something. I wrote the early Redeemer chapter already, like the first decade. And I think that the title I've got for it is Land of Yes. And the early Redeemer members describe the first 5 years as the land of yes. And then if anybody wants to do something, go ahead and do it. And then I pull in there as just essentially saying that you combined Young Life with LaBrie with somehow then also Lloyd Jones. I mean, like just the way that you would mishmash these different influences together.
What I liked about Lloyd Jones was, in some ways, I'll just tell you this. You didn't say, well, what would the relationship be?
Evangelism edify, right?
Well, Lloyd Jones believed his evening services were evangelistic.
Right.
But not the way Americans think of evangelism.
Right.
He just basically, he was just preaching. He favored Old Testament texts and narrative texts because he felt, in general, he thought non-Christians were able to grasp things better if Christian principles were narratively presented.
Yep.
So he would rather, preach on a Jacob narrative to illustrate sin than for the non-Christians, than to preach on Romans 3.
Yeah.
He'd rather refer to Romans 3. So he was narratively, and he also basically, you might say, he said, because he actually talked about it, he favored the non-Christian in his mind. So when he was preaching on it and preparing it, he knew that the Christians would be there. He wanted them to be there. He knew they'd be edified by it.
Yeah.
But he basically favored the non-Christians, concerns or thoughts or that sort of thing. And so even the evening service is a worship service. See, it wasn't a seeker service.
Right.
There was prayer, there was singing, there was that sort of thing.
Right.
And what I was told, and by the way, this is mainly hearsay, what I was told was that his morning services, which were for Christians, was the congregation of about 1,000 people. But his evening services were much bigger, like 2,000, because people from all over. Dick Lucas told me that he would go to hear the doctor in the evening.
Got it. Okay.
When Dick came to St. Helens in 1963, and they didn't have an evening service back then. And Dick said, he told me, I used to go to hear the doctor because he was so good.
Right.
And so what people would do is everybody used the doctor's evening service as the place they would bring their non-Christian friends. So they had like 2,000 people. So what was that? That was a kind of LaBrie thing,
right?
Because it was a real Christian community that was deliberately solicitous of non-Christians present and was very open to them and listening to them. So yeah, I said, oh, wait a minute, that's not Willow Creek.
Right.
That's not typical. Right. And it was brilliant because when people said, he actually wasn't happy with the Billy Graham. By the way, he didn't get up there with Billy. He didn't get up on the platform with Billy Graham. He was okay with Billy Graham personally, but he did not feel like he could. He wouldn't be up there on the platform with Roman Catholics and things like that. He's the doctor, all right. But Lloyd Jones. But what Lloyd Jones did say at one point, somebody said, well, what do you need to support evangelism. And he growled, he says, I have an evangelistic service every Sunday night. First of all, my youngest son was home.
Okay.
He had actually come home from Stony Brook, which he was at a boarding school. He'd come home because he had fractured. He had really had you might want to text Kathy and say what it was. He didn't break his leg, but anyway, he needed surgery or treatment on a leg because of an athletics injury.
Okay.
So he was actually at home with us.
Okay.
So there's only 3 of us at home. And like most people, we spend an awful lot of time on the phone with people. You know, this is phone call ear still, not
Right.
texting and email and so much. There was email, of course,
Yeah.
but just trying to process it. Very worried about what was going to happen inside New York, but also spending a fair amount of time on the with the staff on the phone saying, you know, what are we going to do here? What will it, you know, totally rewriting the service, totally rethinking how we were going to do everything. So it was mainly on the phone with the staff. And of course, I was doing a series on Jonah and I stopped and did something else. I did a sermon on John 11.
Right.
And Jesus and Tomb of Lazarus.
Same
and so we
message.
that was mainly, it was just trying to process, worried about what was going to happen in the city. And also that at that point, people couldn't get anywhere. You know, all the planes were stopped. So we had friends that were, you know, stuck other places. So our 2 oldest sons were, you know, at college. They were okay because they were at college.
Okay.
So anyway, it was, yeah, I don't know. There was I think maybe you may have come across this. I did get a call from whoever the PCH pastor was. I keep forgetting his name. He was a PCA pastor in Oklahoma City.
Okay.
Greg, anyway. And he actually called me that week and warned me that you think that you don't realize that it'll be years before your people in your city are over the shock of this, and there'll be depression and burnout, and people will want to leave the faith, and pastors will quit the ministry because it's much more traumatic than you think. And he was right. I have to say, in my own mind, I do understand the connections between 9/11 and the new atheism.
Right.
And all that happened. But reason for God, I was dealing with the new atheism rather directly and not. The only thing I do know, excuse me, the only thing I do know is that before 9/11, the bad guys were the atheists.
Yeah.
The commies. Right.
Yep.
And therefore, to be against the people who were trying to kill us was to be against atheists. Now, the people who were trying to kill us were religious believers. In fact, very conservative, you might say, religious believers.
Right.
And I could tell that meant a change. And if you can, I did know that. I did see that. And I did recognize that this changes things, because now, instead of religion being the bulwark against the thing that the people who are trying to kill us, now religious people, highly religious people, are the enemy.
Yeah.
And that definitely changes the way people are thinking about things. There's no doubt about that.
Let's go back just briefly on 9/11. You found out about it. How? The attacks? You were watching TV. Somebody called you.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly. It went like lightning. I don't remember who called me. Okay. Somebody probably would have, because it was very early in the morning.
Right.
We were actually getting ready to take Jonathan to the hospital, of course.
Got it.
That was immediately canceled. We did watch the second plane.
Yep.
You know, we did. Nobody saw. I mean, obviously, nobody actually watched this first plane unless you were actually there.
Right.
Downtown. But an awful lot of, and we were watching. And the second plane was unbelievable. And then when they we watched it. Everybody watched it. It was on the TV. And it was astounding to see it actually just disintegrate. I mean, nobody thought that would happen.
Right.
They thought it would burn, and then it would burn out. Right. Not that the entirety of the things would go down.
You're not close enough to have seen. I mean, you would have seen the smoke, nothing else, right?
Yeah, and the smell.
Yeah.
Oh, and the smell was there. It was an unique, indescribable smell. I would might be able to remember it. I mean, it was lasted for 5 or 6 days,
Mm.
and yeah, you could see the smoke, etc. Now, we had an office on Madison Avenue,
Got it.
and there were people at the office. I wasn't there that morning because actually they immediately shut down everything.
Right.
And so everybody who was able to get home who had gone into work came home and usually were covered with ash, by the way.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it was really weird to see people walking because there was no subways, there was no taxis or
Right.
anything. And they're all covered with that. It had to be above ground, and it was raining ash. And
Right.
so everybody was covered in white. It was the strangest thing.
Was the tram still running? Must have been, right?
No, no,
No, they
no.
shut that down
No,
too.
so what you had to do is they had to walk. People who are getting home to Roosevelt Island had to walk over the Queensboro Bridge into Queens, and then all the way up and over into Roosevelt Island. But it was weird. I mean, you could, with binoculars anyway, you can see people walking on the bridge. It was just it was like another planet, another world.
So the smell. I mean, is it the steel? Is it the
I
smoke? Is
don't
it
know.
the human? What is it?
Well,
It's the people.
most of us said it was everything, but we don't know.
Oh man.
But no, you could. By the way, you could. I meant to say we were in this weird spot on our offices on Madison Avenue. Actually, looked right down Madison and right down, and you could actually see the Twin Towers.
Okay.
And so people who were actually Redeemer people who were at the office did watch it all,
Hmm.
literally with their eyes. And if I had been there, I could have seen it like that
Hmm.
from Midtown. It wasn't that hard to see.
Hmm.
Um, so
I don't think I've seen anything on Redeemer members who died or anything like that.
yeah, we had some. I could probably look that up. We had like a couple.
Okay.
We also had a couple. We also had some attenders.
Right.
So
But
uh,
probably not. I would imagine in the immediate aftermath, you're thinking about how many of our people are dead.
yeah, yeah, and it turned out to be less than a handful.
Right.
Less than a handful, which was interesting. But they were all people who worked downtown.
Well, let's jump then ahead to the Oxford missions. And I'm glad you mentioned something about that last time because I would have missed that without you saying something. So you mentioned that they were pivotal. I'm guessing in part they were the first time that you were working out some of the stuff you learned from the Dogwood Fellowship. Is that right?
Yes, the thing that's pivotal is you're right, actually, and this is wise of you. The Dogwood Fellowship helped me read not so much non-Christian. I don't think I want to call Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre non-Christians. I mean, they're both professing Catholics, but basically not non-evangelical social critics.
Right.
And when I started getting into them, I began to recognize the roots of more fully secular people. I do think that Reason for God was still looking at um, generally conservative, traditional minded people who were losing their religious faith. But in order to the Taylor and McIntyre stuff went deeper into what's wrong with secularism. So
Yeah.
it wasn't just evidential apologetics. It was like City of God
Yeah.
in that it wasn't so on here. It wasn't like we can be as rational as you. Look at the evidence for the resurrection. Look at evidence for the historicity of the New Testament.
Right.
So I can make a case for the historical reliability in other words, assuming that they have the standards and I'm living up to your standards.
Okay.
What Augustine did and what these guys were doing is they were actually questioning the standards.
Got
They
it.
were questioning the very basis of secular thought, which is actually something I guess I realized to a great degree I had fallen into the evidentialist mistake of accepting that secular thought is the standard and that Christians can come up to it instead of actually saying, no, this is very, I mean, I kind of knew this. It's Van Tillian Kuyperian. It's saying that that all thought is quasi-religious and is based on faith
Mm.
and uh, faith in certain assumptions about reality. I kind of knew that, but I didn't really see the implications of it until I started reading some of these non-evangelicals who were actually doing presuppositional apologetics, even though they would never call it that.
Right.
Now, when I started reading that and I showed up at Oxford, the fact is that when I started talking with students at Oxford, it was not unlike New York. I mean, New York is a bridge between Europe and America.
Yeah.
New York is more secular, but when I got to Oxford, and these are the best and brightest around the world, it's just the students are just more deeply secular, more deeply skeptical. And I had to start using the stuff I was reading through James rather than more traditional, Warfield apologetics.
Hmm.
That's it. And but I also had to bring it down to earth
Yeah.
because you can't spout Taylor and McIntyre and Reef and Bella to these folks. I mean, you have to actually do it. What does it mean to not say, oh, Jesus Christ will give you wonderful self-esteem and make you feel
Right.
good? But what about questioning the very idea of self-esteem and how you? I mean, that was the sort of thing that I was able to do, but I still had to do it in a way. Even with Oxford students, you still have to find illustrations and you still have to make it cogent. Here's the second time back, I actually pushed back
Okay.
and said, I am actually not going to do exposition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a passage every time. It was always I think it was a John passage, but I'm basically going to do topical speaking. And that's where I did meaning, identity, justice, happiness. I think that was the one Oz Guinness loved. That was a fun year because Oz did the lunchtime talks,
Got it.
what they called lunch bar. So Oz did lunchtime talks in the town hall, and you brought your non-Christian friends to have lunch and listen to Oz.
Yeah.
And then I did the evening messages, in which there was a talk, and then there was a Q&A, and then I would just, Kath and I would just go down and talk to people.
Yeah.
And and both Oz and I stayed in the Randolph Hotel
Mm.
and would talk in front of the fire at the in the bar at night, and then every morning we met with the UK the OIQ visitors, which means what they would do is they what we call it, I call it intervarsity still, but
Mhm.
what they do is they would have the visitors were actually staff members, college and youth staff members of evangelical churches around that worked with each college Christian union to help them bring in their friends.
Got it.
And so every morning the visitors would come and they would give us feedback about how people responded to yesterday's talks.
Mm.
And then we gave them a insight into what we were going to say that day.
Mm.
It was really cool.
Mm.
Honestly, so every morning you got together and Oz and I would get up and we would say, here's where we're going to go. And then they would also tell us what feedback they got about our talks. It was, to me, kind of a high spot in my life, Frank. You can say that because first of all, Oz is not a close friend, but someone I've always admired and respected. And so for him and I to both be the team,
another study center guy.
Yeah, a LaBrie guy, and to be doing it in Oxford, and he's an Oxford graduate, but to be doing it in Oxford was really pretty amazing. It was pretty cool. But that was the year that I did. I changed and did more topical apologetics, and making sense of God was the result. And the last time I spoke was, I would say, which is just 2019. They had me back. I can tell you a little bit more. I'll try to be quick about this. There is no doubt that there was a bigger response. There were more people that signed up for the follow-on courses, and more people became Christians as a result of the second.
Okay.
The second mission than the first mission. But there's no way to prove, Collin. There is no way to prove that it was. You never know. You just don't know. You can't say, oh, well, because he didn't do much. He didn't do the straight exposition. He did more apologetics, and he went deeper. In other words, I went further back to a more I was really addressing a more skeptical person.
Right.
That's what you say that. I was addressing a more skeptical person in the second mission. And there's a better response, but nobody can know. You never know. I mean, the Holy Spirit just decides it's going to help more, he's going to help more. Or, or you don't know anything about the climate at the time. So you can't.
Yep.
However, the most interesting thing is when I came back in 2019, and I was the only, by the way, they didn't do missions without me
Okay.
until I think they are now. But
Okay.
they basically kept bringing me back. One of the reasons was because as an American, I was one of the few speakers they could bring in that would unite the charismatics and the Proctrust people.
Got it. Okay.
Because I wasn't a member of either club exactly, and they all liked my books and this sort of thing. But the last time I basically did the making sense of God thing again. I tweaked it, new stuff, new ideas. And I think I did a better job, frankly.
Mm.
And there was, again, a really good response. I mean, every time it felt like we were getting more traction with people. We were getting more people coming to the. But the one thing they told me that had changed was before that, all the way back into the 40s, these missions have been going. The mission started in the 1940s with Lloyd Jones.
Okay.
They had Lloyd Jones and Stott and people like that, Michael Green, all my heroes.
Yep.
I met Michael Green, by the way, only once, but that was like, I can't remember which one. I think it was the 2015 mission. But these guys are my heroes. But they said that they always only did the follow-on courses, which is the seeker courses,
Okay.
for the several months after the mission.
Yep.
They would stop it. And what they did was after the mission in 2015, they said, well, why should we stop these things? And so they did the follow-on courses on the way in. In other words, they did it, and they decided this was way better. It was way better to instead of getting people cold turkey and then getting them into a follow-up course, cold turkey in the big event, and then had a follow-up course. Instead, what they did was they got people into the follow-up course. They invited people and, hey, well, let's read about Luke, let's read about Mark, let's read about. And then they brought the people in the follow-up course into the big event. And Kathy and I definitely experienced what we would do is, the way that the thing would be is you show up in the Oxford Town Hall and go up there and I'd speak for 25 minutes. Then for 5 minutes, people texted in their questions.
Okay.
While somebody was making announcements.
Yep.
Then they put the questions, select questions and put them up on the board, on the screen. And I would answer questions for another 25 minutes. And then at the very end, I would give a little bit of an evangelistic oomph, appeal. And then that would be it. And when that was over, I would just go down and stand in front of the, in the front of the room, and people would line up and who wanted to talk to me. And I've talked for another 45 minutes to an hour every night with students. It was no doubt the last time I talked to more non-Christians who were really clearly on their way to faith. And I think that's because they used the follow-up courses on the way into the event. I mean, Craig Ellison, Craig missed one of those three. I forget why. I think his wife was having a baby. Michael came to 2 of the 3. Craig came to 2 of the 3. Kathy was there every time. We feel like we really have not really translated that. It's one of the reasons I'm hoping to live a little longer. And I'm not trying to be macabre there, is we feel like we don't see anything like this happening in American churches. We think the stuff we saw going on in Oxford would work here. If a particular church had the will to set things up the way they were setting things up there at Oxford. But anyway.
This is okay. This is the big project Craig was talking to me about then.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we're trying to say, how could we take the things we have learned and put them into a form that you could say to a church, here, do this. But it's not the same as an evangelism explosion package. It's not like, here, give us 10 weeks and we'll train your people to evangelism and then they'll do it. It's not that simple.
Right.
So anyway, it's a long story, but this is
this was one of the most helpful things that you and I have talked about directly about that son.
It's okay.
Because this is not something I could have tracked down that was obviously like in your writings or that somebody else had talked about in an interview.
And actually, you're showing me connection that it was more vague in my own mind than
Okay.
it. No, you're absolutely right in sniffing it out. That
Yeah.
the reading the social critics
Yep.
put me in a position to do a different approach to evangelism than the Reason for God approach.
Right.
In other words, working with people further back,
Yep.
and not just trying to live up to rational standards, but critiquing the very standards.
Right.
And that's something intellectually, I'd heard that, the Kuiper Van Til people do that.
Right.
But when it comes to actually working it out, I wouldn't, Oxford was a place for me to work it out.